You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and the PR consultant Alex Deane. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, The Guardian leads with growing international pressure on Israel to stem its offensive against Hamas in Gaza as Palestinian fatalities in the area since the war started in October approach 20,000. The Times has a warning from Age UK that hospitals will find it hard to keep old people alive over Christmas when doctors stage their latest strike over pay. The Eye reports that bosses at MI6 have been alerted to a possible security threat from a flat owned by Russians that overlooks the security service's headquarters on the Thames in London. After new government guidance to schools on transgender issues, the Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, tells the Mail that teaching children that they can be born in the wrong body is harmful. The Metro reports that a judge in New York has ordered the release of documents on January the 1st, naming associates of the late paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. The Financial Times leads with major European investing house, Civian Capital, taking a €1.2 billion stake in Swiss bank UBS. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Jenny Kleeman and Alex Deane. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with The Guardian and this story, which has been ongoing, actually, over the last few days, and that's the increasing pressure on Israel in terms of the civilian death count in Gaza.
Yes, one approaches these figures with a certain amount of caution because, of course, the situation on the ground is incredibly hard for international observers to monitor, and the statistics we are relying on, it's not a criticism of people reporting them, of course, we haven't got other numbers, come from Hamas, which is a prescribed terrorist organisation in this country. But plainly, when you bomb at this level and this proportion, you are going to have results of loss of life. And that's why I think our Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, is right to urge Israel to take a surgical strike position. But I think there are three things in this, and they're all important. The first is, of course, the humanitarian issue highlighted on the front of The Guardian. The second is Israel's right to defend itself. And the third, which they hint at towards the end of this story on The Guardian, is the importance of keeping together the Western coalition and the Western powers. It's bad enough if the Americans go one way in the United Nations General Assembly and we abstain. We are going down the road of risking having the United Kingdom going one direction on a vote and the US in another. And that would be... I'm not playing down what's happening in Israel at all, but that has a whole other kettle of fish set of connotations. And as our remarks differ from the Americans, that's where we're getting to.
But, Jenny, the US tone has altered as well, though, hasn't it? Perhaps not to the same extent.
There has been a shift in opinion, certainly over the last week, and particularly after these three Israeli hostages who were waving white flags were killed by the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. There is a sense that Israel's rules of engagement seek a lot to be desired, if that can happen. There is also a sense, I mean, the US has been saying for a long time that they don't want Israel to be assaulting all of Gaza, the south as well as the north, but we know now that the south is under siege as well. And the UN Security Council, they are weighing up a form of words that will be acceptable, that America isn't going to veto. And it all comes down to the difference between a suspension of hostilities and a cessation of hostilities, and which form of words is going to work for everyone. I think everyone would agree that we need to have a ceasefire. Everyone would agree that what happened on October the 7th was unconscionable. But when you have an objective like the obliteration of Hamas, that can be achieved by many means. And one of them is the obliteration of Gaza, which, of course, would be completely against international law. So there needs to be a sense of stepping back and the international community being able to moderate what is turning into an incredibly brutal war.
Under the laws of armed conflict, pursuit of your aims have to be proportionate. And there are many people who have made and make plausibly the case that Israel is currently acting within a realistic framework of that, not least because Hamas deliberately hides behind civilians and so forth. But you can't go on forever. You can't go on dropping bombs on an environment forever. And indeed, with an environment in which the civilian population in Gaza is hemmed into an ever smaller and smaller region of the country, of the territory. So there's got to be compromise here. But the reason this isn't just about virtue signalling or the easy thing to say is conflict must stop. But you've got to try and get to a pragmatic point where people agree to say a form of words that all can come to agree with in the UN. And that's why it's so important to try and take the Americans with you. The reason they're holding out is that their view, like some in the United Kingdom, is that currently, you look at which side a ceasefire would favour, it would favour Hamas. It gives an opportunity to regroup, it gives an opportunity to resupply, and currently Israel is winning its objectives. That's part of the equation too.
But an opportunity to
release hostages
of course.
as well.
Of course, but they failed. First of all, they took the hostages, which they shouldn't have done. But second of all, of course, they have not yet delivered the hostages that they could and should have done on the timetables that were set out previously.
And just very quickly, Jenny, do you take positive signals from the fact that the resolution has been delayed for a second day, which suggests that they are trying very hard to come to a wording that's acceptable?
It suggests that there's a real will to make this work.
Agreed.
And for everybody in the Security Council to agree and there not to be a veto. The fact that there is no decision isn't necessarily bad news.
Could be a good thing.
It could be a good thing.
No news, good news. Let's move to the Metro, and this is a message from the wives of Russian troops to Putin. Go die in Ukraine. They are annoyed that their loved ones are being called up and being killed in great numbers.
When I first looked at this, I thought, wow, these women are incredibly brave. And then I saw that it wasn't actually a message to Putin. It was a message on the Telegram messaging app, which is still brave to say anything at all. But there is a lot of frustration from wives of Russian troops who, after yesterday, or earlier in the week, hearing Vladimir Putin's press conference, his press conference where he accidentally suggested that Russia had lost more than 300,000 troops since he started the war last year. A lot of spouses, mothers of people lost, saying that he should go to the front line, and some people going as far as to saying he should go to the front line and die on the front line there. So it is interesting that there is pushback. The fact that within Russia they only get this monolithic state-sanctioned media. But, you cannot deny the fact that people are going to war and not returning home, no matter what the state media is saying. The thing is about Putin, though, is that he knows at the moment, he's expecting peace to be on his terms. He knows that Ukraine is facing a dilemma because the support packages of military and financial support from the US and from the EU are being delayed. They may not come until the new year. He knows there's a possibility that Donald Trump might be president of the United States and that he has very little will to continue supporting Ukraine. So even though this is a long, drawn-out war that is perhaps becoming ever more unpopular at home, he feels in a position of strength at the moment, I think.
It is an act of bravery for women to say this in Russia, because we see in that country people being imprisoned for really very mild gestures of resistance.
And it tells us a lot about public opinion and how it's changing and more prepared to be vocal.
Absolutely right. George McGovern said that he was sick and tired of old men dreaming up wars for young men to die in. And that's a philosophical statement we can all understand. There is a different reality when it's someone you know, someone in your family, and when the Russian death toll gets as high as it is, everybody knows somebody or knows someone someone in their family is gone.
You can't hide that.
To the Eye, another Russian connection. And this story, which is intriguing, MI6 are worried by a flat that overlooks their building that's owned by a Russian person.
Correct.
And they think that's a security breach.
And there is form on this, because not so far from here is the old headquarters of the Financial Times, and their investigative unit was spied on by people hired by people they were doing reporting on across the river, using devices which showed they could listen in to what was being said in the FT building. So it's not just some flight of fancy if you say, I'm not comfortable that a Russian national can see into our secret intelligence service. There's actually something to it.
And it's not just, can they be listening in? Can they see what we're doing? It's as simple as they can see who's going into the building and who's coming out of the building.
Yeah.
So they can identify personnel working for MI6, and that in itself is very significant.
I mean, you would think they'd be a bit more subtle. The owners of this flat, their registered address for the ownership is 300 metres from the Novichok factory in Russia. So, you know, I mean, it does. Some alarm bells are ringing.
Yeah, no, serious story, though, serious story.
Yes.
The FT, let's talk about Scottish taxes. 45% income tax band widens the gap with high earners elsewhere in the UK. This is a surprising move and surprising timing, you know, just before Christmas to land this on the table.
Yes, I mean, the budget was going to be announced today, and so what's interesting is there are now 6 tax bands in Scotland, and the SNP is saying that they want those with the broadest shoulders to be shouldering the greatest burden. 45p in every pound made between £75,000 and £125,000 a year in Australia will, don't know where Australia came from there, in Scotland, will now go in tax. And that means that if you're earning more than £29,000 a year in Scotland, you will pay more tax than anywhere else in the UK. But what's interesting is that there's been this council tax freeze that they have to pay for in Scotland, and that benefits the better off, because the better off are better able to afford their council tax. So it doesn't really make sense, this idea of putting the burden on those with the broadest shoulders. And there is a question that the Scottish Government is getting taxpayers to foot a bill for an economy that is not going necessarily very well there. So this is difficult news, I think, for many in Scotland just before Christmas.
And Alex, the appraisal is that it's not actually going to raise that much money, an extra £82 million in income tax.
I mean, that's max. I've seen other journalists online speculating it's lower than that. But I took a look at Dan Needle's analysis, the scourge of the right, and took down a Conservative former cabinet minister and so forth on tax issues. And his view was that this is really testing the tipping point of the Laffer curve, where the rates go so high you get less money as a result, because the concern will be not only do high earners not feel attracted to move to Scotland, but existing high earners will think about relocating potentially south of the border. I mean, who knows how serious it'll be yet, but I saw a genuine discussion, it looked like on Twitter, of how far away is Berwick-on-Tweed. It's an hour commutable to Edinburgh and will be in a completely different tax bracket. Not just for not for multi-millionaires either. In the bracket they're talking about doctors, hospital administrators, head teachers. These are people that you would think you don't really want to beat up.
Interesting analysis there. Alex and Jenny, thank you very much for the moment. Coming up, the government's guidance on how schools should handle pupils questioning their gender identity has been published. We'll discuss that next. Stay with us. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Jenny Kleeman and Alex Deane. Let's have a look at the Mail and this story. They're quoting Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister here, saying teaching children you can be born in the wrong body is harmful. She's speaking out in support of the government's advice that's been handed to schools for dealing with children who might want to socially transition, have questions about their gender.
Yes, and this is advice that has been 5 years coming, and it's finally arrived. And I think many schools have been saying that clarity is welcome on this issue. It is, of course, an incredibly sensitive issue. And what we're seeing now is a steer away from the kind of blanket affirmation of children who are questioning their gender identity that we used to have in the NHS and that we have had in schools, where if a child says they're trans, they need to be affirmed as trans immediately, that it is OK to ask some questions and involve parents. There is a kind of feeling that socially transitioning, that means changing your pronouns or maybe dressing in a different school uniform, is not a neutral act. It can lead to children feeling the pressure to continue or that they can't change back. So there is a sense of that. So any kind of clarity is useful, but I would say it would be a confusing time for a lot of trans children at the moment who might not feel comfortable with the fact that their parents will be told if they want to go to school dressed in a different uniform or want to be called a different name or different pronouns. And the thing is, kids have to go to school. They don't have a choice about it. And you want kids to want to go to school. So that needs to be handled in a sensitive way. And this is not a statutory, this is not legally binding, this advice, it's just guidance. So there is going to be a lot of discretion between schools, and you would hope that schools can handle it in a sensitive way. And, you know, head teachers have enough on their plate at the moment with having to worry about so much to do with their children's, with their pupils' mental and physical health. This is another thing to worry about, but at least there is, 5 years late, some guidance on this now.
Alex, do you think the guidance is helpful?
Well, I certainly think it's helpful rather than the absence of guidance. But the trouble lies in part, I think, in the fact that Jenny rightly puts her finger on that it's advisory only. And it's trouble in both senses, because you're right to say things are difficult for teachers. They don't go into teaching in order to be judges over children's gender. They go in to impart knowledge and to educate people and, of course, bring them into adulthood more generally. But they don't go in to be arbiters of what sex you are, right? So, of course, it's better to try to help teachers. But on the one hand, because it's advisory only, some parents who want their children to go down this path will say, you don't have to follow this guidance. You should allow us, nevertheless, to progress what we think is best. And indeed, some well-spoken and erudite children will say that. Because this guidance is advisory, you should allow me to do what I want to do anyway.
Well, some senior politicians, like Liz Truss, are saying that it should be legally
that's the problem.
binding.
That's what I meant. So the problem on the one hand is you'll have people saying, don't impose it. And on the other hand, you'll have some people on the right of politics, and it's actually not a left-right issue, so I shouldn't put it like that. You'll have some people who think we ought to state much more firmly that this is what people should do, saying it's not good enough. And there is something kind of ironic here. You were saying, you know, children don't have any choice, they have to go to school. OK, that's because, generally speaking, children are bad decision-makers. We don't let them choose their own bedtime. There's a debate this week about whether they should have social media accounts, but there are some people who still think you should be able to choose your gender. I mean, there's something quite strange about that.
Well, that's another question.
Yes, and we're not going to address that now, because we've got about 60 seconds to talk about this story on the front page of The Guardian. This is repercussions from the Baroness Mone story. Her lawyer now has spoken up.
Yes, this is quite funny.
I'm sure he doesn't think it is.
Baroness Mone admitted at the weekend that she lied when she said she had no connection to PPE MedPro, the company owned by her husband that made an enormous profit out of our desperation for PPE during the pandemic. And her lawyers sent some really aggressive emails and letters before action to journalists who dared to have the temerity to say that she did have a connection to PPE MedPro. And The Guardian has named 3 of her lawyers, and one of them has offered an unqualified apology for claiming that she was not connected to the firm.
I'm really uncomfortable at that sort of thing, because lawyers act on instructions. It's the client's fault if they did something wrong, not the lawyers.